I was stationed in a remote desert outpost, far from any semblance of civilization. The harsh landscape was our constant companion, with its relentless heat during the day and bone-chilling cold at night. Our unit was tasked with patrolling a nearby abandoned village, a relic of ancient times that locals avoided like the plague. One night, under the pale light of a waning moon, we received orders to investigate the village. Rumors had been circulating about insurgent activity in the area, and we couldn't afford to leave any stone unturned. Our convoy rumbled through the desolate terrain, the only sounds being the growl of engines and the whisper of the wind through the dunes. Upon arrival, we split into smaller teams to sweep the village. I was partnered with Sergeant Thompson, a seasoned soldier with nerves of steel. As we moved through the narrow alleys, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The village was eerily silent, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. We entered what seemed to be an old mosque, its walls adorned with faded carvings and inscriptions. In the center of the room lay a large, ornate chest, partially buried under centuries of dust and sand. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to open it, hoping to find something of value or significance. As soon as we lifted the lid, a wave of cold air washed over us, and a strange, musty odor filled the room. Inside the chest was a small, intricately carved artifact. It was a stone tablet, covered in symbols that none of us recognized. Thompson, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as an old piece of junk, but I felt an inexplicable sense of dread. We reported our findings and were ordered to bring the artifact back to the base for further examination. That night, as we settled into our bunks, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The temperature dropped significantly, and an oppressive silence blanketed the camp. It came reluctantly, filled with restless dreams and shadowy figures. The following day, strange occurrences began. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation, and several soldiers reported hearing whispers in the wind. The artifact was stored in the base's makeshift lab, guarded by Private Miller, a young recruit eager to prove himself. That evening, I found Miller standing outside the lab, staring into the distance with a vacant expression. "Miller, you okay?" I asked, placing a hand on his shoulder. He didn't respond, just kept staring into the night. I shook him gently, and he finally blinked, looking at me with eyes full of fear. I heard them," he stammered. "Voices, they were calling my name." I tried to reassure him, chalking it up to fatigue in the desert's eerie atmosphere. But deep down, I felt the same unease. That night, as I lay in my bunk, the whispers came. Faint at first, then growing louder, echoing in my mind. I tossed and turned, unable to escape the chilling voices. Over the next few days, the situation worsened. Others grew paranoid, reporting sightings of shadowy figures lurking around the camp. Thompson, who had been skeptical from the start, began to show signs of distress. He confided in me that he felt something was watching him, following him wherever he went. One evening, while on patrol, Thompson and I stumbled upon a figure standing in the middle of the desert. It was a woman dressed in tattered robes, her face obscured by a hood. We approached cautiously, weapons at the ready. As we got closer, she lifted her head, revealing hollow, sunken eyes. "Leave this place," she whispered, her voice carrying an otherworldly echo. "The artifact is cursed. It brings death." Before we could react, she vanished into thin air, leaving us stunned and shaken. We returned to the base, our minds racing with questions. That night, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Sleep was impossible as the voices invaded our thoughts. Desperation set in, and we decided to consult a local elder, hoping for answers. He listened to our story with a grave expression, then explained the artifact's dark history. It was a relic from an ancient civilization that had dabbled in forbidden rituals. The artifact was cursed, meant to trap and torment any who disturbed it. Armed with this knowledge, we decided to return the artifact to the village and bury it where we found it. As we approached the village, the air grew thick with anticipation. We placed the artifact back in the chest and buried it deep within the sands. The moment we finished, the atmosphere changed. The oppressive weight lifted, and the whispers ceased. We returned to the base, exhausted but relieved. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully. However, the experience left its mark on us. We never spoke of the cursed artifact again, but the memory lingered, a constant reminder of the unseen horrors that lurk in the shadows. As soldiers, we were trained to face tangible threats, but nothing had prepared us for the supernatural terror we encountered that fateful night in the desert. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon, casting a dusky glow over our forward operating base in Afghanistan. As the evening chill settled in, we gathered around the mess tent, trying to shake off the day's fatigue. My name is Sergeant Williams, and I was part of a small unit stationed deep in the heart of enemy territory. Life in the military is filled with routine and camaraderie, but tonight felt different. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a sense of unease that none of us could quite put our finger on. We were a close-knit group, having faced countless dangers together, but something about tonight felt off. It started with small, seemingly insignificant disturbances. Private Harris, a normally composed soldier, seemed unusually jumpy. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his eyes darting nervously. I approached him, trying to figure out what was bothering him. "Harris, you all right?" I asked, placing a hand on his shoulder. He flinched at my touch, his eyes wide with fear. "Sarge, I don't know. I keep hearing whispers like someone calling my name." I frowned. "You're just tired, Harris. Get some rest. We'll talk about it in the morning." But sleep was a luxury none of us could afford that night. As darkness enveloped the base, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just Harris anymore. Other soldiers reported hearing their names whispered in the wind, soft and sinister. The sounds seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. I tried to dismiss it as collective paranoia, a byproduct of stress and exhaustion. But deep down, I felt it too, a gnawing sense of dread that kept me on edge. That night, as I lay in my bunk, the whispers came for me as well. They were faint at first, barely audible, but they grew louder, more distinct. "Williams," the voice hissed. "Williams, come." I bolted upright, my heart pounding. The barracks were dark and silent, save for the soft snores of my comrades. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the room, but there was nothing there, just shadows and the creeping feeling of being watched. The next day, our commanding officer, Captain Mitchell, called an emergency meeting. He looked as haggard as the rest of us, dark circles under his eyes betraying his lack of sleep. "Listen up, everyone," he began, his voice strained. "I know some of you have been hearing things, seeing things that aren't there. I don't know what's causing it, but we need to stay focused. We're in enemy territory, and the last thing we need is to lose our heads." We nodded, trying to push the fear aside. But it wasn't long before things escalated. That evening, while on patrol, Corporal Davis went missing. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone, vanished into thin air. We searched the area thoroughly, but there was no trace of him. Panic set in. We doubled our guard, but the whispers continued, growing more menacing with each passing night. Soldiers who had once been strong and unshakable now looked over their shoulders constantly, eyes wide with terror. One night I was on watch duty with Private Garcia, a quiet but reliable soldier. The night was eerily still, the air thick with tension. As we stood there, scanning the perimeter, Garcia suddenly grabbed my arm. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing towards the edge of the camp. I squinted into the darkness, and there, just beyond the reach of our lights, was a figure. It stood motionless, watching us. My blood ran cold. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice wavering. The figure didn't move. It was as if it were waiting for something. I felt a chill run down my spine, and Miller and I exchanged a nervous glance. "Let's check it out," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We approached cautiously, weapons at the ready, but as we neared the figure, it melted into the shadows, disappearing before our eyes. We searched the area, but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. The whispers grew louder that night, more insistent. They seemed to echo through the very walls of the base, a constant, maddening presence. Sleep was impossible as the voices invaded our minds, filling us with dread. The following day, Captain Mitchell called another meeting. His face was ashen, his eyes haunted. "We need to figure out what's happening," he said, his voice shaky. "This isn't just stress or paranoia. Something is here with us." We decided to conduct a thorough sweep of the area, hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. As we moved through the base, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed to dance around us, whispering our names, taunting us. Then we found it, a small hidden room beneath the base, something none of us had known existed. Inside were old, weathered documents and a large, ominous-looking chest. It was covered in strange symbols. As we opened the chest, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing our lights. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Inside the chest was a journal, its pages filled with accounts of dark rituals and forbidden practices. Captain Mitchell read aloud, his voice trembling. This place was used for dark rituals during the war. Soldiers who went mad with fear and paranoia. They believed these rituals would protect them, but instead, they cursed this place. The realization hit us like a punch to the gut. The whispers, the figures, the disappearances, they were all connected to these ancient, malevolent practices. We knew what we had to do. We gathered every document, every artifact, and burned them, hoping to cleanse the base of its dark history. As the flames consumed the cursed items, the air seemed to lighten, the whispers faded, and for the first time in weeks, we felt a sense of peace. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. To me, they were just stories told to scare children and pass time around a campfire. But that was before my deployment to an old, abandoned fort in the remote mountains of Afghanistan. My name is Corporal Thomas, and what happened to me and my unit during that deployment changed my perspective forever. The fort was an ancient structure built centuries ago by an empire long forgotten. It had been used intermittently throughout the years by various military forces, but for the most part, it stood as a silent sentinel, watching over the desolate landscape. Our mission was to use the fort as a base of operations for our patrols in the area. It was a strategic location, offering a vantage point over the surrounding terrain. The first night at the fort was uneventful, but there was an unsettling aura about the place. The walls seemed to whisper with the wind, and the shadows cast by our flashlights danced eerily on the ancient stone. I chalked it up to my imagination and the eerie atmosphere, but some of the other guys felt it too. As the days went by, small disturbances began to occur. At first, it was just things going missing or being moved. One of our medics, Private Lee, swore he left his medical kit on the table, but found it in the hallway the next morning. Another time, our communication equipment would cut out mysteriously, only to work perfectly fine moments later. It was around the third night that things started to escalate. I was on guard duty with Sergeant Blake. We were stationed on the fort's battlements, overlooking the moonlit landscape. It was a cold, clear night, and the only sounds were the distant howls of wolves and the occasional rustle of wind. Blake nudged me and pointed towards the far end of the battlement. "Do you see that?" he whispered. I squinted into the darkness and saw a faint, glowing figure standing near the edge. At first, I thought it was one of our guys, but as we moved closer, the figure vanished into thin air. We searched the area, but found nothing. The encounter left us both shaken, but we didn't mention it to the others, not wanting to cause unnecessary panic. The next night, we heard the whispers. They started softly, barely audible, but soon grew louder. It sounded like a chorus of voices, speaking in a language none of us understood. The whispers seemed to come from the walls themselves, filling the fort with an eerie resonance. Private Harris was visibly shaken. "What's going on, Sarge?" he asked me, his voice trembling. "I don't know, Harris. Just stay calm. We'll figure it out," I replied, though I wasn't sure if I believed my own words. As the whispers continued, we gathered in the main hall, the only place that felt somewhat safe. Captain Johnson, our commanding officer, tried to maintain order, but even he looked unnerved. The whispers suddenly stopped, plunging the fort into an oppressive silence. It was as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. Then came the apparitions. They appeared randomly throughout the night, ghostly figures in old military uniforms, their faces twisted in anguish. They drifted through walls and stood silently in doorways, watching us with hollow eyes. One by one, they vanished, leaving us in a state of heightened fear. We decided to set up a rotation, keeping watch in pairs throughout the night. I was partnered with Private Wilson. As we walked the perimeter, Wilson kept glancing nervously at the shadows. "Do you think they're real?" he asked me. "I don't know, Wilson. but whatever they are, we need to stay focused. Around midnight, we heard footsteps echoing through the fort. They were slow and deliberate, moving closer with each passing second. We shone our flashlights in the direction of the sound, but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped right behind us, and I felt a cold breath on my neck. We spun around, weapons ready, but found only empty air. Wilson's face was pale, his hands shaking. "This place is cursed, Sarge. We need to get out of here." "We can't just abandon our post," I replied, trying to steady my own nerves. "We'll stick together and keep watch." Sunrise isn't far off, but the night seemed to stretch on endlessly, each minute feeling like an hour. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic. They seemed to be calling out to us, pleading, warning. The ghostly figures reappeared, their expressions more desperate and sorrowful. Private Harris had a breakdown. He started screaming, clutching his head as if trying to block out the voices. It took 3 of us to restrain him and calm him down. We kept muttering about seeing soldiers from another time, their faces twisted in pain and fear. Captain Johnson decided we needed to investigate the fort's history. Maybe there was something in its past that could explain the hauntings. We found an article on the internet. It was written by a soldier stationed at the fort during a long-forgotten war. The article detailed how the fort had been a site of intense and brutal battles. Soldiers on both sides had died horrific deaths, and their spirits were believed to be trapped within the fort's walls. The last entry was particularly chilling. It spoke of a curse placed upon the fort by a dying enemy commander, condemning the souls of those who perished there to eternal torment. We realized then that we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. The whispers, the apparitions, they were the tortured souls of the soldiers who had died within the fort. I'm Sergeant Mark Lewis, and I've been through a lot in my military career. I've faced enemy fire, survived grueling conditions, and witnessed things that haunt my dreams. But nothing prepared me for the night my patrol vanished without a trace. It was the winter of 2010, and we were deployed in a remote region of Eastern Europe. Our mission was to gather intelligence on suspicious activities in the area. The locals spoke of strange occurrences, but we dismissed their stories as superstitions. They mentioned an old forest, untouched for centuries, where people went missing and strange lights were seen at night. They called it the Forest of Shadows. Our base was set up in a small, dilapidated village near the forest's edge. The villagers were friendly but wary, always looking over their shoulders as if expecting something to emerge from the dark woods. We paid little attention to their warnings, focused on our mission. One evening, Captain Davis assigned me to lead a night patrol into the forest. My team consisted of Corporal James, Private Sanchez, and Private Jones. We were all seasoned soldiers, confident in our abilities and equipment. As we geared up, the villagers watched us with a mix of fear and pity. An old woman approached me and handed me a small amulet, muttering something in her native language. I took it out of respect, though I didn't believe in its supposed protective powers. We set off just after sunset, the cold air biting at our faces. The forest was dense, the trees towering above us like silent sentinels. As we moved deeper, the sounds of the village faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. The only light came from our flashlights, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with every step we took. About an hour into our patrol, we came across a clearing. It was an unnatural space, as if the trees had been forced apart by some unseen hand. In the center stood an ancient stone monument covered in strange symbols and moss. It looked out of place, like a relic from another time. "Anyone know what this is?" I asked, shining my flashlight over the carvings. "No idea, Sarge," James replied, his voice tinged with unease. "But it gives me the creeps." Sanchez and Jones examined the area while I tried to decipher the symbols. They were unlike anything I had seen before, a mix of geometric shapes and runes that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie glow. "Let's keep moving," I said, deciding not to linger. "We need to complete our patrol and get back to base." We continued through the forest, the monument and clearing fading into the darkness behind us. But the sense of unease lingered. It felt like we were being watched, though we saw no signs of life. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of our boots on the forest floor. Suddenly, we heard a rustling sound behind us. We spun around, weapons ready, but saw nothing. The trees stood still, and the shadows remained unmoving. We pressed on, our nerves on edge. As we approached a small stream, we saw something that made our blood run cold. On the opposite bank, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It watched us silently, unmoving. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure didn't respond. It simply stared at us, its presence sending chills down our spines. We slowly backed away, keeping our eyes on the figure. It didn't follow, but its gaze remained fixed on us until we were out of sight. "What the hell was that?" Sanchez whispered, his face pale. "I don't know," I replied, my mind racing. "But we're not alone out here. Stay alert." We picked up the pace, trying to put as much distance between us and the figure as possible. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees whispering secrets we couldn't understand. I felt the amulet in my pocket, its presence strangely comforting despite my skepticism. We were about to cross another clearing when Jones suddenly stopped. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his eyes wide with fear. We listened and heard a faint, melodic humming. It was a haunting tune, beautiful yet sinister. The sound seemed to come from all directions, growing louder with each passing second. "Move," I ordered, but it was too late. The ground beneath us began to tremble, and the air filled with a thick, choking fog. We struggled to see, to breathe, as the forest seemed to come alive. Shadows darted around us, and the humming turned into a deafening roar. I grabbed James by the arm and pulled him forward, but Sanchez and Jones were nowhere to be seen. "Sanchez! Jones!" I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the fog. We stumbled blindly through the forest, the roar growing louder, the shadows closing in. James tripped and fell, and as I reached down to help him, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there. "We need to get out of here." James screamed, his eyes wild with fear. We ran, our footsteps echoing through the night. The forest seemed to twist and turn, disorienting us at every step. The fog thickened, and I could barely see James right in front of me. The shadows followed, their presence a constant, menacing threat. Just when I thought we would never escape, we burst out of the forest and into the open fields. The fog dissipated, and the roar faded into silence. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding. "Sanchez! Jones!" James whispered, his voice breaking. I looked back at the forest, its dark entrance, like a mouth ready to swallow us whole. There was no sign of them. We waited for hours, hoping they would emerge, but they never did. When we returned to the village, the old woman who had given me the amulet was waiting. She took one look at us and nodded sadly. "The forest of shadows has claimed them," she said, her voice filled with sorrow. We conducted a search mission the next day, but there was no trace of Sanchez and Jones. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The villagers believed the forest was cursed, a place where lost souls wandered forever. I kept the amulet as a reminder of that night, a symbol of the unseen horrors that lurk in the shadows. The military never found an explanation for the disappearances, and the mission was classified. But I knew the truth. The forest of shadows was a place where reality and nightmare intertwined, and those who entered were never the same. To this day I hear the whispers in my dreams, calling me back to the forest. And I know that somewhere, Sanchez and Jones are still out there, lost in the darkness, waiting for someone to bring them home.